Hello, everyone. This is a recorded lesson which I'm just experimenting with, and I guess after we were unable to meet and I'm feeling like you're maybe getting a little bit tired of reading through Isaiah 1, I thought I'd introduce Isaiah 2 through 4 for you. After listening to this lesson and this little talk I'm going to give, I hope that you can move on. We are going to be talking about Isaiah 2 through 4. Um, the It is obviously longer than just Isaiah 1, but not as much as you'd think. It's not three times longer because Isaiah 4 is pretty short. And in order to make this somewhat longer passage seem not so rambling to you, what I'd like to do is do a little bit of explanation of an ancient literature form called a chiasm. It's something that's really quite common in the Bible, way more common, I think, than we very often realize. It's sometimes called a figure of speech, but I don't think that's quite right because we're not talking about whether we take something literally or not, but instead rather just a structure that I think reflected an audio-oriented age, one where there weren't a lot of there wasn't a lot of ability to write things down for people for books, and they memorized a lot of things by listening to them. And I think that this sort of symmetrical structure helped them remember, and I think they also got used to the way it would work. And in a chiasm, just like the letter X, and the Greek word chi is where that name comes from, which looks like an X, you have a symmetry. At the top, you have a section that looks just like the section at the bottom, so they kind of match up. And then as you move towards the middle, you have more sections that look the same until finally you get to the very center and you have kind of a unique section in the middle. And this would be the most important section usually in a chiasm structure. The most important part is actually in the middle. And then once you get to the middle, you start having things that sort of harken back in reverse order back to the earlier parts. And that really is the structure of Isaiah 2 through 4. I'm going to go through and show that to you. I'm not going to read every word in Isaiah 2 through 4, especially not this section right here, which is a little long. But and when I say that they match up, they don't match up word for word. You'll see that they aren't always the same length, but the same ideas show up over and over again, and it's really very interesting. I think it'll sort of help you see a little bit better what's going on in Isaiah 2 through 4. So with that as an introduction, let's take a look at the start of Isaiah 2. Here it says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all nations will flow to it." Now, I mean, this section here is very obviously talking about something at the very end of time. This is something that had not been really done a lot before Isaiah's time. You'll see an occasional reference in the Psalms, the earlier Psalms before Isaiah, and also in the books of Moses to the fact that God is moving towards something. But Isaiah makes a big deal of this, much bigger than really pretty much anyone that had come before him. And so this is an important passage here. The very first time he talks about the latter days, right here at the beginning of chapter 2. And we talk about the mountain of the house of the Lord. And obviously that's going to make his original listeners think of Jerusalem on the mountain that it sits on. And I think that you can see here that the idea is that all the nations suddenly recognize that God really is God, and that he may teach us our ways and walk in his paths. So in other words, all the nations are going to be looking to the people of Israel and for the law of the Lord that they might learn. You see how the word for out of Zion will go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this is really a big promise for them. Here we see some words that are very often quoted. "He shall judge between the nations and decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." And of course, there's probably no better indication that this is talking about the very end of time, because it's certainly never been true until now that people have gotten rid of their weapons. It is an interesting sort of thing to see that the United Nations has this statue based on this passage of Scripture of a man beating a sword into a plowshare. And I do remember when I was a child seeing those words engraved on the side of the United Nations building in New York. Kind of ironic, I think, seeing as how the United Nations doesn't seem to have the time of day for Israel, but I think they're just taking these poetic words out of context and say, wouldn't it be great if there just wasn't war anymore? Of course, this passage makes it clear that it's only the Lord and the nations streaming to the law of the Lord and understanding who the Lord is that's going to make this possible. And of course, then this sort of great call that happens afterwards, O house of Jacob, come let us walk in the light of the Lord. This sort of call, and this passage here is a little bit of a transition. It partly goes up this way, but then it also partly goes with what comes after. But we're not going to get into that just yet, because what I've been doing is showing you really the first part of that chiasm. That's this part right here that we just looked at. And now let's jump down and look at the bottom part. And this is really most of chapter 4. You can see, as I said, it's really quite short. In that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and a smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. And I mean, this is so obviously a reference back to the time when God was so closely with his people Israel. The idea of the cloud by day, which is what led the people through the desert, and the smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. This was the divine protection that the Israelites had during their entire time during their wandering in the desert. But notice, it's the whole site of Mount Zion. So instead of God wandering, we're talking about God's presence kind of resting finally and fully in an earthly place, in a single spot of Mount Zion. And so we're talking about the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. I think that this is obviously tied with these two are obviously tied together. You can see, but what's interesting to me and should be to you too is that are these words, who is left in Zion, because this is something else that is really something that we talked about a little bit in chapter 1, the idea of a remnant. In other words, not everyone that's part of Israel is going to participate in this. And this is kind of, again, a bit of a new emphasis. I think you could have seen it if you looked carefully in the books of Moses and in some of the other things. But really, starting with the book of Joshua and moving on, the history of God's interaction with Israel was always sort of one for all and all for one. All the people suffered together or did well together. But here, for the first time, Isaiah is saying, look, that hasn't worked out, and God is going to go through with a spirit of burning and a spirit of judgment and clear out the wicked people from Israel and from Judah, and instead have the just simply the righteous remain. So, and that I think is that's I think a really fascinating sort of picture. Now there is, so that really is the first element of the chiasm. We've read now the beginning of chapter 2 and most of chapter 4, and those form the two ends. Now, what I want to do now is look at the next intersection. This is one that God, where Israel or Isaiah is seeing God rejecting the people of Israel, the house of Jacob, and it's interesting to see how and why, because I think you'll understand a little bit better the structure. They are full of things from the east. The idea of the house of Israel is that they were supposed to be a light to the people. They were supposed to be different. They were supposed to be the one that people went to get knowledge. But instead, they're becoming just like everyone else. When they say they strike hands with the children of foreigners, I think they're talking about what we would call shaking hands. Shaking hands was something that kind of came up in the Middle Ages. The idea here is that that they are, sort of giving high fives to foreigners. And the problem with this is that they've gotten so wealthy doing that. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and their hand is filled with horses. There's no end to their treasures. And what I want you to notice here is that these are really the two things, if you will. I mean, here we're talking about money, and here we're talking about power. When we talk about horses and chariots, I mean, we have to remember that was really the height of military equipment. So, I mean, today, of course, we think of, bombs or whatever else we think, kind of gives people power. But that's not the way Isaiah saw it. He saw that Israel had gotten very powerful, that they'd gotten very rich, and because of that, they had forgotten about the Lord, and they bowed down to the works of their hands, as you see, and they just became idolatrous, and their land is filled with idols, and I think that this is really the part of this chapter that I think goes on quite a bit about this humbling. And I'm going to say something that I don't want it to sound sexist, but this idea of money and power, I think these are men's things. I mean, that the men that ran the show, that was what they were after, was money and power. And you see here, the haughty looks of man shall be brought low. I do think he means men here and not just mankind. For the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. I mean, a godly man and an honest man will always be looking to realize that how weak he is. And I think as this goes on, Isaiah has goes over quite a bit here that we're not going to repeat, but I do think that this is sort of an interesting summary of a number of things. Stop regarding man, in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he? I mean, that anyone that has breath can lose their breath. Anyone that lives by having a beating heart and breathing lungs can die. And so this next passage talks about how God is going to take away. He's going to take away all these things. I mean, that without water, without food, all of a sudden, all these things that they thought were so important. You can't eat money, and you can't eat. I guess you could eat a horse, but you can't eat a chariot. And all of these different men's positions are going to be humbled and be sort of despised and brought down. And I think it's interesting at the end he sort of illustrates this by saying, you have a cloak, you be our leader, and let this heap of ruins be under your rule. So in other words, anyone that's special enough or lucky enough to have even just kept on to his clothing, just clothing, is going to be considered great. So instead of all the things that they're chasing after right now, God is going to reduce them to the point where they really are realizing that that's the case. And this section here now is, again, just to remind you, we had a little vision of the final days, and now we have the judgment. And here we're talking about men. And now what I'm going to do now is show you how women are basically talked about in the opposing section. If we go and look at the second section of this sort of alternative section here, we say, the Lord said, because of the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go. And you can sort of hear the contempt in Isaiah for these sort of high fashion, fancy women that think there's something special, tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion. The Lord will lay bare their secret parts. Again, the women found their influence in that day. Really, not all that much has changed. Very often, just simply by being able to sort of bewitch men to have their beauty win what they wanted. And you can see, that once again, it starts out with talking about how they have these things, and they seem like there's nothing that can take it away. But it says, in that day the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the tinkling as they walk, the headbands and the crescents, and all these things. And then he has this, instead of perfume, there will be rottenness, instead of belt, a rope. Talking about how all the things that make them desirable are going to be gone. And again, a parallel section to the men looking for a guy that just has a cloak. You have this at the end saying, and 7 women will take hold of one man in that day, saying, "We will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach." So in other words, they're down to the point where they're just willing to scrape along with whatever they want, and they're just hoping that anyone will call him their own. So I mean, again, this is just a tremendous humiliation. So we've seen now, if you kind of see those two things, and when you read them, because they're not in direct order the way we're looking at them now, it's a little confusing. But that's the way that this piece fits together. And now, as we look at the final section, this is now the center of the chiasm. Say, "For Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because of their speech, and their deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence." And we saw, if you remember, and I know a lot of you have been reading we've all been reading this Isaiah passage. So they proclaim their sin like Sodom, and here's this idea of the remnant again. "Tell the righteous that it will be well with them. Woe to the wicked, it will be ill with him." And I do think it's interesting that when he talks about the righteous, he talks about them in the plural. In other words, there are going to be righteous people, but the wicked are going to pay one by one for the things that they have done. I think that this is that this is it. Now, there's so much more that we could cover in this. I just wanted to spend maybe 15 or 20 minutes going over this so that you can be encouraged to start reading this. You see this idea at the very end of this center section of sort of tying together with what's going to be coming next, because there's a Song of the Vineyard that we're going to look at in Isaiah 5. But in 2 through 4, there's this extended prophecy that has the end times and how glorious it is, but then the judgment before sort of being enclosed in that. And at the very center, this idea of sort of the viciousness of men making their own lives better by crushing the poor underneath them. Because let's not forget that these ancient empires, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and even the Romans, they didn't get wealthy because they figured out how to manufacture things more cheaply. They just got more efficient at subjugating people and forcing them to pay taxes to them in larger and larger areas. And that's how they accumulated their wealth. And so this idea of crushing people, God was really very unhappy with the Israelites, that they were really just trying to do the same thing they saw everyone else doing. I pray for God's blessing and the Holy Spirit on you as you read Isaiah 2 through 4.